Ever heard of a marriage ending up as like a viral court case?
Yeah.
What if the reason wasn't infidelity or abuse or anything like that, but something called psychological incapacity?
Oh, yeah.
We're diving into one of those headline-grabbing cases today,
Really interesting.
one that went all the way to the Philippine Supreme Court.
Yeah, it definitely sparked a lot of conversation online. This wasn't just some celebrity split or anything like that.
Exactly.
It really touched on something a lot of couples struggle with.
Yeah.
What happens when a marriage just becomes unbearable because of like personality clashes or some really deep-seated issues?
Right, so today we're unpacking GR No. 2475A3 Rommel Espiritu versus Shirley Ann Boac-Espiritu, decided on October 6th, 2021.
Wow.
Get ready for a story about conflicting personalities,
No, yeah.
a legal battle,
Yeah.
and what it truly means to be, quote, psychologically fit, unquote, for marriage under Philippine law.
And this is what makes it even more interesting is because this case really shines a light on how the courts balance individual rights with the societal importance of marriage as an institution.
For sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So picture this. Rommel and Shirley married back in 2000. They had 3 kids.
Okay. Typical family.
Seems like a pretty average family.
Uh-huh.
But fast forward to 2010,
Okay.
and Rommel, who is a police officer, files for nullity, claiming Shirley psychologically incapacitated.
Now, this is where it gets tricky.
Oh, boy.
Philippine law is very specific about what constitutes psychological incapacity as grounds for nullity.
I bet.
It's not just about having a difficult spouse.
Right.
It has to be something much deeper.
I bet people were quick to judge just from the headlines.
Oh, for sure.
So what exactly did Rommel have to prove to convince the court?
He needed to demonstrate 3 crucial elements.
Okay.
The first one is juridical antecedents, meaning this incapacity existed before they even got married.
Uh-huh.
The second one is gravity.
Correct.
The condition has to be so severe that fulfilling marital duties becomes, like, impossible.
Right.
And lastly, incurability.
Gotcha.
It can't be something that therapy or treatment could easily fix.
So it's not just irreconcilable differences.
No.
It's a much higher legal standard.
Way higher.
So what kind of evidence did Rommel present?
Well, his testimony painted a picture of Shirley as distrustful and jealous.
Okay.
He described incidents of her smelling his clothes for other women's perfume, constantly checking his phone and bank records, and just frequent outbursts and accusations.
Wow, those are some pretty intense details.
Yeah.
But I guess the question is, did the courts see these as proof of like a deeply rooted psychological condition or just like the typical ups and downs of a marriage?
That's a good question, and that's exactly what the lower courts grappled with.
Okay.
Both the regional trial court and the Court of Appeals ended up siding with Shirley.
Wow.
They ruled that Rommel just hadn't provided that clear and convincing evidence needed to overcome what's called the presumption of marriage validity.
Okay.
Basically, the law kind of assumes a marriage is valid unless proven otherwise.
2 courts in a row. That's a big setback for Rommel.
Yeah.
So did he give up or did he take it to the highest court in the land?
He appealed to the Supreme Court.
Of course he did.
Which brings us to the crux of this deep dive.
Here we go.
What was the Supreme Court's take on this whole psychological incapacity issue?
Right.
Did they agree with the lower courts or did they see things differently?
This is where it gets really interesting
Yeah.
because the Supreme Court's decision in this case had the potential to really impact how similar cases are handled going forward.
Big time.
What did they have to say?
Well, the Supreme Court took this opportunity to really emphasize what psychological incapacity isn't. They made it clear that it's not simply about having a difficult spouse or even just facing marital challenges.
Okay.
It must be a serious, enduring psychological condition rooted in a person's makeup that truly prevents them from fulfilling their marital obligations.
So they were setting a high bar,
Yeah.
not letting people use this as an easy way out of a marriage just because things got tough?
Exactly. And they didn't stop there. The Supreme Court also pointed out something really crucial: the potential for power imbalances in nullity cases.
Interesting.
They were concerned about the lasting consequences of declaring someone psychologically incapacitated.
That makes a lot of sense because one spouse could be more financially or socially vulnerable.
Right.
So it's important to make sure that the law is being applied fairly
Yes.
and not being used to take advantage of someone.
Especially when children are involved.
Right.
They were particularly concerned about the impact on children and ensuring that their well-being is considered.
Yeah, so it's not just about the individuals involved.
Right.
It's about the family unit and the societal implications.
Exactly.
So after all that, what was the final verdict?
Okay.
Did the Supreme Court overturn the lower court's decisions, or did Rommel lose his case?
Well, after carefully reviewing everything, the Supreme Court ultimately upheld the lower court's decisions.
Wow.
They ruled in favor of Shirley.
Interesting.
This meant that their marriage remained legally valid.
Wow. So even with all the accusations and testimony, the court wasn't convinced.
Nope.
That really makes you think about how seriously they take these cases, right?
Yeah.
It's not easy to prove psychological incapacity in the Philippines.
Not at all. This case wasn't just about Rommel and Shirley.
Right.
It provided a chance for the Supreme Court to clarify the law and set important precedents for future cases.
This whole case really gets you thinking, doesn't it? What does this tell us about how mental health is understood within the context of marriage? We'd love to hear your thoughts on this case.
Yeah, it raises some interesting questions. And this case wasn't just a one-off either.
Right.
It really reflects a broader trend that we're seeing
Okay.
in how psychological incapacity is understood and applied in Philippine law.
Oh, that's interesting. I remember reading somewhere that it used to be a lot more about like diagnosing a specific mental disorder.
Exactly.
Has the focus kind of changed over time?
It has. In the past, it was almost like checking boxes.
Yeah.
Does this person have a diagnosable condition listed in some manual?
Mm-hmm.
But over time, there's been a move towards a more nuanced approach.
So it's less about labels and more about the real-life impact on the marriage.
Exactly. It's not just about a diagnosis anymore. It's about whether the condition actually prevents someone from fulfilling the essential obligations of a marriage.
That makes a lot more sense because like two people could have the same diagnosis but have totally different experiences in their marriage.
Absolutely. Context is key. And that's actually why expert testimony from psychologists or psychiatrists can be so valuable in these cases.
Yeah.
They can really help the court understand the nuances of a person's psychological makeup and how it plays out in the specific context of their marriage.
It's like they're not just saying this person is incapable of any marriage. They're looking at this particular relationship.
Right.
And whether it's fundamentally broken because of these really deep-seated issues.
Exactly. And this shift towards a more holistic approach also recognizes that psychological well-being isn't always black and white. It's about looking at the whole picture, communication patterns, conflict resolution, emotional maturity, and really the couple's overall commitment to the marriage.
It's almost like they're assessing the psychological health of the marriage itself, not just like labeling one person as the problem.
That's a great way to put it. And this reflects a growing understanding that marriage is really a partnership. And that both individuals really contribute to its success or failure.
And this is where I think the Supreme Court's emphasis on power dynamics is so important.
Yeah.
Because if it's so nuanced, there's room for one person to manipulate the system.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The court was clearly aware of that risk. They were really concerned about the psychological incapacity argument being used as a weapon to gain an unfair advantage, especially if one spouse is more financially or socially vulnerable.
That's what makes these cases so fascinating. It's not just about the legal technicalities. It's about real people's lives and the potential for the system to be used unfairly.
Right. And remember, in the Espiritu case, Shirley was the one who was primarily caring for the children.
Yeah.
So declaring the marriage null and void could have put her in a really, really difficult position.
Yeah.
Financially and emotionally.
It's a reminder that, like, these legal cases aren't happening in some abstract world.
No.
They have really real-world consequences for families and individuals.
For sure. And the court recognized that they wanted to ensure fairness and protect the more vulnerable spouse, especially when children are involved.
Okay, so we've talked about this shift toward a more nuanced understanding of psychological incapacity.
Right.
But what about, like, the legal burden of proof? Does that play a role here, too?
It definitely does remember the concept of presumption of validity that we touched on earlier.
Yeah.
The law starts with the assumption that a marriage is valid. It's up to the person challenging the marriage, in this case, Rommel, to prove otherwise.
So it's not enough to just say, my spouse is difficult, I want out. You have to provide strong evidence that meets this very specific legal standard.
Correct. And this burden of proof becomes even more crucial when you're dealing with something as complex as psychological incapacity.
Right.
The evidence has to be clear and convincing,
Yeah.
demonstrating that the condition actually existed before the marriage, is serious enough to prevent fulfilling those marital duties, and is incurable.
So basically, Rommel's testimony about Shirley's behavior, while it might have seemed troubling to some people, wasn't enough to meet that high legal bar.
Exactly. The courts just weren't convinced that her actions were rooted in like a deep-seated psychological condition that met all of the requirements for nullity.
This makes me think about expert testimony again.
Yeah.
If proving psychological incapacity is so difficult, wouldn't an expert witness be crucial in a lot of these cases?
You're absolutely right. While expert testimony isn't strictly required by law, it can be incredibly helpful in providing that clear and convincing evidence that the courts are really looking for.
Because an expert can connect the dots between a person's behavior and the underlying psychological issues, right?
Yeah.
They can help the court see the bigger picture.
Exactly. And that's especially important when dealing with something as nuanced as psychological incapacity.
Right.
A qualified expert can provide insights that the court might not be able to glean just from the couple's testimony alone.
So it's not just about presenting a diagnosis. It's about explaining how that diagnosis, manifests in the marriage.
Uh-huh.
And how it prevents the person from fulfilling those marital obligations.
Precisely. The expert can provide context analysis and a professional opinion that can help the court make a more informed decision.
It seems like expert testimony could be especially important in cases where the behavior might seem normal to an outsider, but is actually indicative of a deeper issue.
You're absolutely right. Sometimes the most damaging behaviors are subtle and really difficult to articulate. And an expert can shed light on those nuances and help the court understand the true impact of the psychological condition on the marriage.
This whole conversation really highlights how complex these cases are.
Yeah.
It's not just about legal definitions.
Yeah.
It's about psychology, human behavior, and really the very nature of marriage itself.
It really is, and it's a good reminder that the law is constantly evolving to keep pace with our understanding of these complex issues.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to circle back to the social impact of these cases.
Okay.
We talk about how the Espiritu case sparked a lot of discussion online.
Yeah.
But what about the broader implications,
That's an important point. These cases don't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
They have these ripple effects on society as a whole.
Because when a high-profile case like this goes all the way to the Supreme Court, it inevitably influences how people view marriage and relationships, and even mental health.
Absolutely, and it can really spark public debate and potentially lead to changes in laws or policies.
So, for example, do you think that this case could lead to greater awareness and acceptance of mental health challenges within marriage?
It's hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
There's always a risk that these cases could be misconstrued or oversimplified, which could lead to some harmful stereotypes.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they can also open up these really important conversations and destigmatize mental health issues.
So it's like a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it's great to have more awareness.
Right.
But on the other hand, we don't want people thinking that every marital problem is a sign of psychological incapacity.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between acknowledging the legitimacy of psychological incapacity as a ground for nullity, but also promoting understanding and support for mental health within marriage.
And it's also important to remember that not everyone who's struggling with a mental health condition is incapable of having a successful marriage.
Absolutely. Every situation is unique. And it's really about finding the right support and resources to address those challenges, whether it's through therapy, counseling, or other forms of intervention.
This case really makes you think about all the different factors that contribute to a successful marriage.
Yeah.
From individual psychological well-being to the overall health and functionality of the relationship itself.
It does, and it really underscores the importance of communication, understanding, and a willingness to work through challenges together.
So what are your kind of final thoughts on the Espiritu case and its significance?
Well, I think it's a landmark case that provides valuable insight into the evolving understanding of psychological incapacity in Philippine law.
It certainly gives us a lot to think about in terms of the complexities of marriage, mental health, and the legal system.
It does, and it underscores the importance of approaching these cases with sensitivity, nuance, and a commitment to fairness for all parties involved.
Yeah. It's a lot to unpack, that's for sure. But this deep dive wouldn't be complete without addressing something we haven't really touched on yet. The human element behind all the legal arguments in court decisions.
Right.
There are real people with real emotions.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the legal intricacies.
Yeah.
But we can't forget that this case involved a couple who went through a very difficult and painful experience.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder what led them to this point.
It does.
What were the underlying issues that eventually drove them to seek a legal solution.
And that's really where the psychological aspect becomes so crucial. You know, we can speculate based on what's in the court records,
Yeah.
but ultimately we don't have access to their personal history,
Well,
their communication patterns,
yeah.
or like the day-to-day dynamics of their marriage.
It's like the limitations of a legal case, you know?
Yeah.
The court can only assess what's presented as evidence,
Uh-huh.
but there's always so much more beneath the surface.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to approach these cases with empathy and understanding.
Yeah.
Even if one party is found to be, like, at fault, it doesn't mean that the other party is completely blameless.
Right. Relationships are complicated.
Yeah.
And there are always two sides to every story.
Always.
And it's important to remember that seeking a legal solution, like an annulment,
Right.
that's often a last resort.
Yeah.
It's usually a sign that the couple has really exhausted all other avenues, like counseling or therapy.
For sure.
So that makes you wonder if there are lessons to be learned here.
Yeah.
Even for those of us who aren't, like, facing marital breakdown.
Right.
What can we take away from this case in terms of building healthy and sustainable relationships?
That's a great question. I think one key takeaway here is the importance of open and honest communication.
Yeah.
A lot of marital problems just stem from a lack of effective communication.
Right.
Whether it's bottled up resentments or like unspoken needs and expectations.
So instead of letting things fester and build up,
Yeah.
address those issues head on when they come up.
Exactly. And that requires a willingness to really listen to your partner, to empathize with their perspective, and to work together to find solutions.
And that probably also takes a willingness to be vulnerable and admit when you're wrong. And be open to change and compromise.
Absolutely. Relationships require effort and a willingness to constantly adjust and grow together.
This whole case also makes me appreciate the value of seeking professional help when it's needed.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that's not a sign of weakness.
No.
It's actually a sign of strength
Yeah.
and a commitment to the relationship.
For sure. Therapy can really provide a safe space to explore difficult emotions and develop healthier communication patterns.
It's like having a neutral third party who can help you see things from a different perspective and guide you towards solutions.
Exactly. And sometimes just having that outside perspective can make a huge difference.
Right. So I guess the bottom line is
Yeah.
relationships take work.
They do.
And when things get tough,
Yeah.
it's important to have those resources and support systems in place to help you navigate those challenges.
Absolutely. Whether it's therapy, counseling, or even just having like a strong network of supportive friends and family.
Right.
Having those resources can make all the difference.
This has been such an insightful deep dive.
Yeah.
We've really explored the legal complexities, the psychological nuances, and the human drama behind this whole fascinating case.
Yeah, it's been a lot.
So what's like one key takeaway that you hope our listeners will remember from this whole conversation?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway here is that marriage, while a beautiful and cherished institution, it isn't always easy.
Of course not.
It requires constant effort, understanding, and a willingness to grow together.
Yeah.
And when challenges inevitably arise, it's so crucial to seek help and support.
So well said. It's a good reminder that we're all human.
Yeah.
We all make mistakes.
We do.
And sometimes we just need a little help along the way.
We all do.
For sure. So by learning from cases like this one, hopefully we can all build stronger, healthier, and more fulfilling relationships.
Yeah. That's the goal.
This case has given us so much to think about.
Yeah.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts.
For sure.
What resonated with you the most about Rommel and Shirley's story? Share your comments and your favorite takeaways, and let's keep this conversation going.
And if you're craving more deep dives into these fascinating legal cases and the stories behind them, hit that subscribe button.
Do it.
We'll be back next week with a brand new case and a whole new set of insights.
Awesome.
Until then, stay curious and keep learning.